It is April 1945 when we first meet Eleanor and Hick in Amy Bloom's beautiful new novel, White Houses. World War II is in its final fiery months in Europe and Japan, and America is mourning the sudden death of FDR. But in a quiet New York City residence, they are two women reuniting.
I sit down on the living room couch to wait. I used to be able to read Eleanor's heart when I saw her face, and I worry that I can't anymore.
Bloom fell in love with their love story while she was researching her last novel, the New York Times bestseller Lucky Us, which was set in the FDR era of the 30s and 40s.
What is that like to have the kind of love that everybody hopes for and not be able to shout it from the rooftops, not even be able to whisper from the rooftops, but still to know that the love is the center of your life?
Hick, who was a star journalist of her day, traveled openly with Eleanor and even lived in the White House, where FDR's indiscretions were an open secret. But she was often cropped out of photos, and to this day, there are those who insist their relationship was platonic, even though their personal letters dispute that.
We have 3,000 letters they wrote to each other, sometimes 4 and 5 times a day. 18 boxes of letters.
Which you've read.
Which I have read, and it was just sort of really exploring a secret garden. It was enormously revealing and moving.
When we sat down with Bloom inside historic Hanley House in Clayton, she talked about the lure and lens of history and how she discovered her own path as a best-selling writer and novelist in this edition of Maryville Talks Books One-on-One with Amy Bloom, presented by Maryville University and Left Bank Books, and media sponsor St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU, and HEC TV. Amy Bloom, thank you so much for joining us. So the new book is White Houses.
It is.
Was that always the title?
It wasn't always the title. At one point, I was combing through Emily Dickinson's poetry, and in fact, all of the chapter titles in the book are lines from Emily Dickinson's poem, except the very last one, which is from a Walt Whitman poem. And it was No Life But This One, which I really did like, but as a friend of mine pointed out, it sounded so much like a movie from 1939 that maybe I didn't want to go full romantic flowery. And then my friend Tiari Jones, who's a novelist, said, how about White Houses? You have all these houses and they move around from the apartment to the White House to the little house on Long Island. And I thought, you're right, White Houses is good.
So the story is a work of fiction, but it's based on this very real, beautiful love story between Eleanor Roosevelt and Lorena Hickok. We know who Eleanor Roosevelt is, but many of us are just finding out about Lorena Hickok, also known as
Hick. Yeah. What she liked to say is that she believed that she was a distant relative of Wild Bill Hickok, but I don't think there's any evidence for that. There's a lot of evidence for other things in the book, but not for that claim. You know, and there's autobiographical material, and she was a very successful journalist. She was the first woman to have a byline in the New York Times, and so it's not that there is no material about her. And she went on to write a number of books, including a very well-known young adult book, a biography of Helen Keller that was a bestseller later in her life.
How did they meet?
They met because Hick had just finished covering the Lindbergh baby kidnapping and sort of needed a break. And Franklin was running for governor, and Hick's editor suggested to her that she cover Eleanor Roosevelt. As people said, you know, she's dull but pleasant, and go see what's up with that. And they met and really liked each other, and so then she suggested to her boss that she, Hick, cover Eleanor Roosevelt, that be her beat while Franklin was running for governor. And so they met, and then he became the governor. He was already the governor, sorry, and then he was running for president. And there's a famous story actually about Eleanor weeping when he won the presidency, and Hick trying to cheer her up.
What first introduced you to this story and pulled you in to want to write the novel?
Well, because I read a lot of history, you know, you encounter a lot about the Roosevelts, and I have been particularly struck actually when I had been first encountering the Roosevelts on the similarities between the response as a nation to Franklin and Eleanor as there had been to the Obamas. And you know, for people who thought that we could not sink lower in sort of, you know, the vituperative and the uncivil and the appalling. You have only to look at history to think to yourself, oh, it's not true that we couldn't sink lower. We actually already have sunk lower, and every once in a while we just climb out a little bit and then sink back down. So they were everywhere, and there's a wonderful biography of Eleanor Roosevelt by Blanche Wiesen-Cook, and reading that really introduced me for the first time to this love affair that Eleanor Roosevelt had had while she was First Lady.
And we have this wealth of letters.
You do. You have 3,000 letters. They wrote to each other sometimes 4 and 5 times a day. 18 boxes of letters.
Which you've read.
Which I have read. And it was just sort of really exploring a secret garden. It was enormously revealing and moving.
This is such a bold story because what comes across to you right away is that this was a physical attraction, a mental attraction. This was a real, true love story.
Yes, it is what you hope for.
At a time when you couldn't be open about that love.
Right, and so part of what was interesting and challenging to me in the novel is what is that like to have the kind of love that everybody hopes for and not be able to shout it from the rooftops, not even be able to whisper from the rooftops, but still to know that the love is the center of your life.
And we see through the novel, they have their little mini acts of rebellion in that realm.
They do. Yeah.
Of a hand over a hand here.
Yeah, I mean, there were also, you know, women of their society, I mean, especially Eleanor, and these were people who believed in good manners. And so they didn't have any wish to particularly upset people. On the other hand, who among us would willingly let go of that kind of love?
This relationship changed both their lives. In some ways, it changed Lorena Hickok's more because she ended up giving up her very prominent position that she had fought very hard to achieve. She was the top reporter for the Associated Press.
She did. I mean, she gave up her career as a journalist, which was a tremendous loss. Also, she found herself, having been a poor girl in South Dakota and a servant, living in the White House, chatting with Winston Churchill over a brandy at 11 o'clock in the morning. That was not the life that she'd expected to have. So there were certainly some compensations for what she gave up. And later on, when they were more apart, she returned to writing and was actually quite successful as an author, which is one of the things that made the story for me slightly less heartbreaking.
One of the things you've addressed in many of your interviews is the attempts or the way that historians and people in general have tried to whitewash this, even in the face of some pretty important evidence, like the letters.
Like the letters, like I put my hand on your photograph and weep because you are not next to me. Does not sound to me like the kind of letter you jot off to a friend.
And yet, so many people still try to say, oh, no, that's not what it was.
No, they were just pals. She was such a Victorian. She was so effusive. It's like, well, yes, she was effusive, but some things are a little harder to mistake than others.
On a more practical note, how did it not get out and how did it not really threaten his?
Well, I think some people knew. I mean, you know, it wasn't like Lorena was sort of a glamorous TV anchor kind of lesbian and nobody would have, I mean, you know, she looked like a gym teacher. You know, she looked like the kind of lady you would think to yourself, oh, I wonder if she's lesbian. And indeed she was. And she was very mindful of that. I mean, she understood that. And one of the things that made her very protective of Eleanor's reputation was Eleanor said, people hate me anyway. So what difference does it make? And I think that from the White House's point of view, as long as people in small towns across America were not talking about it and were not upset, it didn't matter. And there were lots of people in America at that point who had never even heard of a relationship between two women that was romantic. And so it didn't move the needle.
Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, is the icon that we all think we know, of course, but really the star and the narrator of the story is Hick. we learn more about her through this, of course, and we also learn what she came up from, and it was a pretty rough childhood and beginning.
It's a very rough childhood, and at one point in the novel, she and Eleanor are comparing childhoods because they were both orphans. But as Hicks says, what it is to be an orphan and a Roosevelt, and what it is to be an orphan and a Hickok of Bodle, South Dakota, are very different things. And her mother died when she was 13. She was raped by her father. She was encouraged by her father and his subsequent girlfriend, who were going to move on and move out of South Dakota after a series of failed businesses, to go out as a hired girl, which meant that you basically moved in with a family. You lived in the back room if they had one, or slept on the floor of the kitchen, got up at 5 or 6 to get the fire going, clean the house, get breakfast started for the family, run to school. When the bell rings at 3 o'clock, run back to the family, take care of the children, make dinner, and go to sleep and start all over again 6 days a week for, if you were lucky, $1 a week. And the fact that she was determined, since she knew that she was not going to be ideal marriage material, both because of her own temperament and also because she wasn't an adorable little girl. She was a really strong-minded, chunky girl who was not given much to smiling when she was told to smile. So I think she knew she had to be smarter and more persistent than most other people.
And it's extraordinary to think that this life didn't destroy her. It
didn't even curdle her. You know, she was determined and had a sense of humor and was really feisty all of her life. It's not to say she didn't have strong opinions about some of the things that had happened and about the ways of the world.
You came to writing late in life. I understand you did not major in English in college, is that right?
I did not major in English.
Theater, is that right?
Theater and political science.
And then even when you went on for a second degree,
social work.
Right. So you always had that deep interest in people and humanity.
Deep interest in people. I was also a very good bartender. Nobody ever mentions that when they talk
Which
about my resume.
Is the best training, I think, for motherhood and every other field, because underappreciated, underpaid, and you still have to go to work every day.
Yep. And you have to have comfortable shoes.
And people throw things at you.
They do, often fruit. Yeah.
Very true. And you're always sort of mopping up a mess. No, that's true. But yeah, so you came to writing later, but was it, where did it figure into your childhood? I know you've talked about living at the library and being a child who loved to read. Tell me about your childhood growing up and how you did you fall in love with reading first and then later?
Oh yeah, I didn't have any thoughts about writing. I did love to read. I was actually hoping, I remember this very vividly, that there would be a job that mostly was reading. And that, like, maybe at the end of the week you would report on all the books you had read, and then somebody would hand you money. And I didn't see any evidence of that job, but that was sort of the job that I had been looking for. But my dad was a working journalist, and my mother had been a journalist as well. She had been a gossip columnist. She had a very early radio and TV gossip column. And my dad worked at home, and I think that was a great help to me in the sense that I never thought writing was glamorous. I never thought it was like writing with a capital W.
You always saw it as real work.
It was like being a plumber. It's like you get the gig, you do the work, you turn it in, and they send you a check, and you pay your bills. And my father was very clear about that. You know, that he was very fond of the Samuel Johnson quote that nobody but a blockhead ever wrote except for money. And that was the job. You wrote and you got somebody to pay you. So I read. I read all the time. I learned how to read actually in the barber shop. My dad would go for his every 2 weeks haircut, and there were a huge stack of comics on the floor. There was Little Lulu and Archie and Superman, which I really liked, and some little devil. I just remember the look of the devil, like Red Hot, the little devil, and that's how I learned how to read. And I remember holding up the comic book and reading out Superman to my father, and he said, "Okay, let's get you a library card," and off we went. And they were very supportive of reading. I don't think it would have ever occurred to them that there was something that I should not have read at a certain age. I think their theory was, if it was inappropriate for me, I wouldn't understand it, and I would either go to the dictionary, which would be a good thing, or I would forget about it, which would also be a good thing.
It's funny, I often think it's a shame that this generation of kids never really got the comic thing, because we were the same. We used to fight over it every Sunday, and I feel like it gave you a good sense of pacing and economy.
Yes, yes, excellent narrative pace, I agree.
So how did you turn from that professionally? As you said, you majored in theater and then moved into social work, which actually you were, and still are, right?
I don't really practice anymore.
Not anymore, but you did
I
for
did
years.
for a very long time, and really liked that work. And I started writing late at night, and just sort of kept at it, and then sent out stories to be published, and then when they got published, they got some attention, and then I had a book contract, at which point, when I had the book contract, I felt that I could say that I was a writer.
Do you remember what started pulling you toward it? Was it something that, because writing it's hard.
That's horrible. Yeah, I don't think I thought about it very much. I was actually on my way to become a psychoanalyst, and I had a meeting with the guy who was going to be my supervising analyst, and we had a very nice chat. And on my way home, I passed actually the college that I had gone to, and I was remembering when I had been a bartender, because that was back in the day when you didn't have to be 21 to tend bar, and so I used to work the events for extra money. And one of my jobs was at the end of the evening to go around and wake up all the elderly alumni who were like sort of passed out on the couch. And I think that really it was my job to make sure they weren't dead. And I thought, well, wouldn't that be a great mystery if like there was a corpse and it was found in the president's house of the university? And so the first thing I wrote was a mystery. And I really was very engaged with it. I would write, after I put the kids to bed, I'd write for a couple of hours at night whenever I could sort of pull myself together, because I was working full time. And when I finished, I sent it to my only reader, who was my high school English teacher, who loved me. And he wrote back and he said, you know, sweetheart, love the characters, the dialogue is so fresh. I don't really know much about mysteries, but shouldn't there be more than one suspect? And I thought, oh, I see that is a problem. And I couldn't think of who the other suspect should be. So I just sort of let it lie for a while. And eventually, when my first short story collection got published, they also bought the mystery, which I had improved somewhat, but I really did feel that it was sufficiently unimproved that I bought it back from them.
You did?
Yes, I just thought no trees need to die for this book. So.
Well, that's funny. So you started out submitting short stories, I understand,
sure.
Right? And then eventually?
Then some of the short stories got some attention, so then I had a collection, and then I just sort of kept working away at it. But I didn't quit my day job for another 10 years.
Your first novel was Love Invents Us. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And at what point did you feel like you broke through in terms of the level you're at now, I guess? I know it's a slow... I don't really... You don't want to say...
No, I don't really understand the question. I mean, I feel like, you know, my job is to write the books, and some of them do better than others. They do better commercially than others, and some of them people like more, and some people like less. But my job is to write the best book I know how to write at that period of time, which tends to be what I think about. For example, I don't read reviews. So whatever breaking through would look like, I try really hard not to focus on that. I feel like my job is to write the book.
Your characters are so vivid and the details are so rich that, especially something like, say, Away, Lucky Us, you think, gosh, this would be an awesome movie. And you have written for television. Have any of your books ever gone down that road in terms of...
Well, I think probably like every other even mildly successful novelist in America, the books have gone down that road. It doesn't mean anything's going to happen.
Right. There's a lot of false starts with it, right?
Yeah, it's a lot of spring snow. Mm-hmm. And so I don't mind. I don't take that personally. White Houses has actually just been optioned, and I think it's more likely than some of the other projects to come to fruition, and so we're going to do it as a mini-series.
Oh, really? Oh, wow. Can you tell us where or what, or is it?
Mike Lombardo, who used to be at head of drama at HBO and now has Buster Productions, so he's optioned the work. Katie Couric is going to be attached as the executive producer, and Jane Anderson, who wrote Olive Kittredge, is attached to direct.
You have a huge fan base. What's it like to meet the people that have been affected by your novel?
Oh, that's wonderful. I mean, I really try not to think about the reader when I'm writing, but once the book is done, to get to come to St. Louis or Cleveland or San Francisco and meet people who love the work, who have feelings about the characters, who have opinions about the characters and what they should or shouldn't be doing, is a real gift. It never occurred to me when I was writing that anybody outside my immediate family was ever going to read my work. And so to encounter people whom I don't know, who feel connected to me and to the work, is really a gift. It's a wonderful thing for a writer.
When a reader finishes one of your novels or even a short story, what are you hoping they walk away with, or do you have any
hope
hopes?
that those characters are vivid to them. I hope that the story is alive for them, that it stays with them, that it matters. And the shape of that mattering and the shape of the characters isn't important to me. I don't have a theme or a takeaway message, but I hope that they have been so engaged that it's a little hard to leave.
When you are finished with a novel, do you feel drained or do you feel sort of invigorated that you got it out there? Or?
It's both. It's kind of like getting over the flu. You know, like you're really happy that you're healthy. On the other hand, it did take kind of a lot out of you.
That sounds about accurate, I would say, right? Amy Bloom, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a
pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
I sit down on the living room couch to wait. I used to be able to read Eleanor's heart when I saw her face, and I worry that I can't anymore. I want her to feel that with me, she's home, like it used to be. She sent me away 8 years ago, and I left, and 2 days ago she called me to come, and I came.